Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. And welcome to the fifth week of Sahapedia's Culture for All Digital Festival 2021. We started this festival in January 2021, and after almost a year-long celebration, concluding it in October and November. The festival, supported by Tata Technologies, has been curated with a focus on diversity and inclusivity, and we have performances, talks, workshops, trails, contests, and much more to keep you engaged with culture. The festival has been put together to celebrate the release of a first of its kind interactive, multilingual, open access digital cultural map by Sahapedia. And you can access this at map.sahapedia.org. We'll give you a sort of short glimpse of the website through a video. And Sayali, if you can play that video, that would be great. Thanks very much for showing that, Sayali. And I hope that those who've joined us will get a chance to take a look at this map that we've put out. In any case, welcome once again to week 5 of the festival. In today's session, we will speak with Tony Joseph about his book, Early Indians, the story of our ancestors and where we came from. Thanks very much for joining us, Tony, and welcome to the session.
Thank you, Neha. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today. But first, to introduce all of you to Tony, Tony Joseph is a journalist and has been a columnist for leading newspapers and magazines. He has previously been editor of Businessworld magazine. He's the author of the best-selling book, Early Indians, the story of our ancestors and where we came from. The book has been published in multiple languages. Today, our discussion will center around this book, the first edition of which was published in 2018, but the second edition of which was released earlier this year in 2021 by Juggernaut Books. So the book itself draws upon a number of disciplines, including population genetics, archaeology, climate science, and linguistics, to distill a lot of research to answer some central questions. Who were the earliest Indians that we can today trace our ancestry back to, and where they came from? The book is compelling and gives even those readers who have no familiarity with these disciplines a foothold in understanding these complex questions. It is dense with information, but written almost in the manner of a story or many stories. So, Tony, if I can begin with this question, how did you come to write this book, or what led you to it?
When I started on this project nearly 9 years ago now, I had no idea, I had no concept that this would finally end up as a book on the ancestry of Indians. What I thought I was starting on was a book on the Harappan civilization and trying to answer the questions of who the Harappans were, where did they come from, where did they go, and why really did it take more than 1,000 years for cities to come up again once their civilization disappeared around 1900 BCE. For some reason that I can't fathom, the Harappan civilization always had a hold on me. Mm-hmm. And it always annoyed me that there were no really good questions to any of these, no good answers to any of these questions. And we really didn't know where the Harappans were or who they were, whether they were our ancestors or they were not. And so when I had a little bit of time on my hands, when I had given up many of the other responsibilities that I was holding, I thought it would be a good idea to try and trace these questions back and see whether we had come any closer to answers in recent years by looking at what happened in multiple disciplines. So that's how it started. And once you started, you realized that really you can't answer the question any question about the Harappans without answering the question, who were the first farmers of India? Mm-hmm. Because you can see from the archaeological record that the Harappan civilization grew naturally and gradually out of the agricultural revolution that had mm-hmm. happened in northwestern India, starting from around 7000 BCE. So mm-hmm. it's over thousands of years that the Harappan civilization began to take shape, first as villages, then fortified villages, then towns. So then you started inquiring into and trying to figure out who were the first farmers, where did they come from? And then you realize that you can't answer the question either without answering the question of who were the first Indians. Mm-hmm. So without my realizing over the years, the nature of the scope of the project kept expanding until somewhere in the middle, you started wondering whether this is ever going to end at all, because it had ballooned into something which was much larger. And I really thought there is a reason why nobody had attempted something of this kind in this manner. And it was pretty foolish of me to have started on this. Then you also stumbled upon the fact that a lot of questions about population formation in different parts of the world, the answers to that were coming from a relatively new discipline called population genetics. Mm-hmm. And that was fascinating. It was a difficult field to get into, difficult to grasp, but it took me a couple of years to try to trace that. And then you could see how the new findings of population genetics gelled or fit in with the findings from other disciplines, which I had spent a lot of time understanding by then. So, so that's how it fell in place. And what I thought would be a book on the Harappan civilization ultimately turned out to be a much more fascinating journey, ending up in a book on who were we Indians.
All right. Well, I'm very glad that you pursued this project because I've personally enjoyed reading the book a lot. To show everybody the book, this is the one. This is the second edition of the book. Um, you said that you asked, like it led to multiple questions.
Yeah.
Could you briefly lay out what the answers you set out in the book are? You talk about multiple migrations that make up the Indians, as it were. So could
Yeah.
you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the best way to start answer that would be to say a very quick summation of how the world's population formed.
Please do.
And then you can see in that context, how did the Indian population form, as well as other populations. We all know today that the modern humans, the earliest place where you can find modern humans are in Africa. And all modern human populations outside of Africa can trace their ancestry back to Africa. And we also know that the first out of Africa migration that led to the peopling of the world happened around 70,000 years ago. So now we know that the rest of the world got populated somewhere within the last 70,000 years, with different parts of the world getting populated for the first time at different times. The last continent to be populated was the Americas, and we think it happened sometime around 20,000 years ago, or maybe a few thousand years earlier or later. But that's the spread of time that it took for modern human population to spread across the world. And this, as the modern human populations were spreading across the world, there was also a glacial period that came in between about 29,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, a pretty long period. So population groups that were spreading around the world got separated from each other during this period, because during the glacial age, large parts of the world become uninhabitable and arid. And that keeps populations away from each other, which also meant there were minor genetic differences that cropped up between different populations in different parts of the world. Though even today, 99%, all modern human populations share 99.9% of their DNA. So these minor genetic differences did occur. And sometime after the glacial age ended, starting from around 10,000, 12 to 12,000 years ago, we can see modern human populations in different parts of the world experimenting with agriculture. Not all of those experiments were successful. Not all that were successful were sustainable, but in a few regions, people were lucky because they were in regions where they could domesticate cereals, like such as wheat, barley, etc., rice. And these lucky regions were Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China during slightly different periods. But and here, because cereals can lead to high productivity, because people who were domesticating, let's say, bananas and
tubers
and things like that, they are not as productive. So it didn't lead to immediate lifestyle changes. But people who could domesticate cereals, they saw dramatic changes in their lifestyle. People settled down, started farming, slowly over a period of time gave up hunting and gathering entirely as a way of living. So it led to, and another one consequence of that change was a huge population explosion, because farming populations grow at a much higher level than hunting and gathering populations ever did. Right. So wherever farming began, what we see are a population growth and population explosion of a kind that has never been seen before. And the result of those population explosions are migrations.
Right.
So then you can see that this is the second event that is shaping modern world demography. The first event was the out of Africa migration, which over a period of time affected all of the world's population. The second event was this, that some parts of in some human population groups taking to agriculture, their populations growing dramatically, and then their populations migrating, changing demography the second time in large parts of the world.
Right.
The third time this happens again, is because some human population groups in Central Asia master the art of wheels, wagons, horses, and which also gives them mobility of a kind that had never been seen before. And these population groups start migrating and dominating large regions of what you could call Eurasia, including Europe, Central Asia, West Asia, South Asia, all the way up to China. So this you could call the Yamnaya migrations, and subsequent migrations subsequent to that. So this is a period, you could say the Bronze Age migrations that changed the demography of a large part of the world. So these are three events that shaped the demography of a large part of the world. There's also a fourth event that shaped world demography to a large extent, that some of our ancestors would have borne the consequences of that. Those are the colonial migrations.
Right.
Because some human population groups mastered the art of traveling over large distances over the seas and getting into new areas and dominating those areas. So you could see, and this colonial expansions of population movements changed the demography in large parts of the world, in the Americas, in Australia, and in many other parts. And so these are the four large migrations, you can say, that shaped world demography to a large extent.
Right.
Now you can, there are other migrations also that change. Obviously, because migrations happen all the time in all regions. But if you are looking at macro level, large level migrations that happened over significant periods of time and affected significant areas of the global demography, this would be it. Now we can come to, so how do we talk, how do we understand the Indian population?
Yes.
You will see that the last one, which is the colonial migrations, did not affect us much because the number of migrants who reached India as a result of colonial migrations was very small compared to the existing population of India. So they did not leave a large mark on our population. So we have to look at, we have to exclude the last of the colonial migrations and look at the next, the
first three,
to see how our population formed. And you will see that we had two agricultural related migrations, not one, one from the west and one from the east. So we had out of Africa migration, which is a group of people who, the out of Africa migrants who reached India around 65,000 years ago. That's the first peopling of India. And that happened around 65,000 years ago. The second agriculture related migrations took place around 12,000, 10,000 years ago, broadly during that period. And then the agricultural expansion takes place in northwestern India. And then you have population that are spreading over the entire Indian subcontinent. So that's the west, that's the agricultural related expansion that is happening from the region of the west. There is also an agriculture related expansion that reached us from East Asia as a result of China taking to agriculture. Where population movements that starting from China, which affected all of Southeast Asia, and the last leg of it reached India probably around 4,000 years ago, or a little earlier or a little later. So these are three migrations already. And the fourth one, the Central Asian migrations that we talked about, the Yamnaya related migrations of people mastering the art of wheels, wagons, horses, mobility. They're reaching India in the period between 4,000 years ago to 3,500 years ago, or 2000 BCE to 1,500 BCE. These are the four large migrations that have shaped Indian demography. And there is nothing special about this. As we discussed, almost all population groups in the world are the result of multiple migrations that happened in history. So when we say that the Indian population is a result of all large migrations, we are not saying something special or out of the world, because that's the way all population groups are formed by mixing, and as a result of the mixing of multiple migrations that happened in history. So that, in a nutshell, is the story of early Indians, of how the Indian population formed, what migrations happened when, and how do we arrive at these conclusions? What are the scientific data and the evidences that we have to support this? So,
All right,
I hope
thank you.
that
Yes, it does answer my question. And thank you for laying it out like that. I also want to explore what you mean by, you said this is not unique to India. And in your title, you've used the word Indians.
yes,
Although in the text itself, oftentimes you say that India is a current political entity. And so obviously it did not exist as it is back
yes,
then.
yeah.
And so why use the word Indians in the title? Could you explain a little what you mean by the term, who you include?
Yeah. First of all, India in the title and in the text of the book refers to the Indian subcontinent, or in a broader sense, the South Asia, and not just the Republic of India as we know it today. And the reason why, the reason for that is simple, because this is looking at the population formation of this region of what we call Indian subcontinent or the South Asia is similar. All of those parts of this particular region got peopled by broadly the same. The demography got shaped by broadly the same factors, or broadly the same time frames, and that makes the population formation of this region applicable. The principles that you would lay out is applicable to all of this region, and there is no better word that captures this region really than India. In the same way that if you were to look at the beginnings of modern human ancestry in Africa, you would talk about it as Africa. For all, and I do not know when the continent came to be called Africa. It may be in the last few hundred years, but there is no better word to describe it, and everybody quite understands what you mean when you say, the modern humans all share their ancestry with people in Africa at some point of time. So India here is a signifier of a region which shares common ancestry from more or less same migrations over broadly the same periods of time, and that is the Indian subcontinent.
And also you talk about cultural continuities in your book. So it's ancestry as well as some amount of cultural continuity that is there in this region from various.
That's correct. Especially when you're looking at the factor that the Harappan civilization and the people who made the Harappan civilization spread across the entire region, carrying with them many of the cultural practices that had been brewed or distilled in the Harappan civilization over thousands of years.
Right. In the subtitle of your book, you also say the story of our ancestors and where we came from. And so I just want to talk a little bit about, or maybe if you could speak about the audience that you wrote this for. You must have had some kind of reader in mind, and if you can talk to that.
Yeah, I had no doubt any point of time that the main part of the readership for this book would be from the Indian subcontinent, precisely because it is dealing with questions that are on top of the mind for people of this region. And so the writing the intro as it's not something, it's something that came naturally. It came naturally out of the fact that one had no doubt who the main readership of this book would be. In a sense, I have found, I have had reviews of the book from people outside of this region also. And it was interesting to note that one of the reviews in the Asian Review of Books told other audiences that you may be turned off by the headline, by the by the way it is put in the book, our ancestors, early Indians, etc. But it would be your loss, because this book looks at population formation from a perspective that you have not seen from earlier. It is an Indian perspective, but adds much more because of that. So I think this looks at population formation in this region from the perspective of this region.
Okay, you talk about population formation, and in the book you say that there's about all Indians currently, subcontinental populations, can trace about 50 to 65%, in fact, of our DNA ancestry back to the first Indians.
Yes. And yeah, that's correct. And it is surprising because there in many parts of the world, that's not the case. It's not the case in Australia. It's first Australians do not form 50 to 65% of the ancestry of the Australians today. It's not the case in Europe. It's not the case in America, but it is the case in India that the ancestry of the first Indians forms a base, or to use the imagery of early Indians, if you look at the Indian demography as a pizza, the first Indians form the base of that pizza. That's what is all across the region. It has spread, and that's the base. And we often forget this. And so, I mean, the book begins with first Indians, and this is I made it. It was I was committed to making first Indians a significant part of the book, because it is a significant part of a story. It's a significant part of our ancestry. It's the base of the ancestry, and we do not often have enough information about it. And this was a chapter that was most difficult to write, because there is not enough information, enough insightful information that you can gather about that period compared to obviously the later periods. But I think we have managed to squeeze as much information as is possible from the studies and the research that is out there, and it was very rewarding. I think in the book I say that we have to change the way that we see our history, because too often we see our own history as beginning with the Vedic civilization or even with the Harappan civilization, but we have a story that goes much beyond. We have to see it in its entirety. The fact that we do not see it often in that way is deleterious in many ways also. For example, that's part of the reason why many people in India look at the tribals as some people very different from them. But the fact of the matter is the rest of the population of India has no closer relatives anywhere in the world than the tribals. So we do not see it that way, because that's not the way we see our history. So we have to see our history differently, to see this reality also. And so that's one part.
And this is very much part of your focus on prehistory.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But you've in your book, you've said that partly, and in today's discussion as well, you started off by saying that there were a lot of recent developments in population genetics, which sort of must force us to change the story we tell ourselves about ourselves.
Absolutely.
Right. So could you speak a little bit about how you stay on top of this research, and also what kinds of research you draw upon to write this? Because it's also interesting to me that you wrote this book in 2018, and within 3 years we have a second edition. And why is that? So what are the differences between the two as well, which may be related to the research?
Yeah. As you correctly said, some of the fields are fast moving, such as population genetics. Some are not so fast moving, but there's constantly new research happening in all of these related fields. And that's the nature of science. There are always new evidence that is coming in, which most of the time puts more flesh and more details and more nuances onto the story that you know. And keeping track of all of these things happening in multiple fields is a difficult question, and a question that I grapple with every day. And it becomes easier because since it took me so long to write this book. It's 6 years of effort. And when I say 6 years, people do not realize, usually it is said in a manner that says, apart from everything else, I was also doing this book for 6 years, but this was not so. 6 years, this is all that I did. This was my major work. There was nothing else. So since it was done over such a long period of time, you had built basis of knowledge and where information is available, and people, contacts with people, large numbers of experts in all these fields. And that helps in making sure that there is you have an ongoing understanding of what's happening. Some of the mechanisms that you use are, commonsensical ones, like setting up Google alerts on topics that are of interest to you, making sure that you have access to journals and other research papers in the areas that you are interested in, following institutions and people who are making who are focused on these areas. And frankly, the surprise for me has been that how often I have been alerted to new discoveries by complete strangers, very often on Twitter, on new research that's happening. So it's a compilation. It's a combination of all these things. I won't say that I have found the perfect answer, but yeah, it mostly works.
All right, thanks. I also wanted to say that this book is not an easy read. As you said, it draws upon multiple disciplines. For you to process this information as well, it took some time. So it's also challenging for a reader. It's very dense with information.
Yeah.
So are there any specific means you or your editors have used to try to make this an easier read for people, perhaps drawn from your practice of journalism itself? And
Asika, it has not been an easy book to write because of the fact that, just to give it one example, moving from one chapter to another was like moving from one book to another. It was not like usually moving from one chapter to another, because you would be dealing with an entirely different period, very often entirely different disciplines, entirely different experts, because it's a large period. You will not find too many people who appear throughout the book, because these are dealing with such large periods that the sources of information, the sources of expertise are all very different. So each chapter was like starting on a new book altogether, and I would be surprised by this every time, because you finish one chapter and you're coming to the second one, it should flow easily, but you will find that it's not so. It's almost like beginning anew. And what made this so considering the difficulty of writing this, putting this together, I must say one is also surprised whenever I go to Amazon.in website or the Goodreads website, look at the reviews and find how many of them comment about how accessible the book is to the layperson, or how easy it is to read. I think what made the writing of the book difficult is the fact that the subjects that it deals with, one of the things that makes it is that the subject it deals with is, what shall I say, there are many of them are political hot potatoes, highly controversial, highly debated. And this is unlike, you will see very few countries in the world where prehistory, not recent history, not history of the last few hundred years. Prehistory is a matter of very hot political debate. And that what made it necessary for me, I felt it was necessary to back every statement that you make in the book with facts, supported with scientific facts, reasoning, and even the intricacies of reasoning. For example, if you're looking at, it goes throughout the book. If you are talking about the first modern humans or the first Indians arrived in India 65,000 years ago, it's not enough to say that that's broadly the scientific consensus. It needs to go into the question of what exactly does that consensus consist of? Which exact papers said what, and what are all the steps that lead to that conclusion? So at each step, you have to go into the scientific data, the methodology, and the reasoning behind each step. And so I would say writing the book was like building a fortress. It's not like building a garden, building a fortress in the sense that you have to foresee what the counter arguments could be, or the counter other sides of the
Positions.
picture could be, and take that on board already. So this is not something that you will face in every situation. For example, if one were writing about how the dinosaurs lived in the land that we today call India, it probably don't have to go into the intricacies of scientific findings for each statement that you make on how the dinosaurs lived in India. By and large, you can go by saying this is what scientists believe. So, but that's not something that is available to this book. So that was one of the reasons the book, to some extent, this is also what makes the book valuable to many of the readers, because they get familiar with the mechanisms or the methodologies of different disciplines that they had not applied their mind to earlier, whether it is linguistics, whether it is so it gets you much more familiar with some of these scientific fields. So the second thing, which when you write a book of this kind, is that when you're dealing with prehistory, is that there are no characters. There are no flesh and blood characters. There are no queens and there are no kings and queens, or no usurpers and challengers, no heroes and villains, because in prehistory there was no writing. And forget about characters. We don't even know the names of people or the names of the places they lived in. So what had to take, something else had to take the place of characters, and that in this case was interesting questions. And the search for answers to those interesting questions had to do the job that interesting characters do in histories with which can draw on those kind of factors. So if you were to ask, I mean, the answer to your question, what did I bring from journalism to this writing of this? I would say is that a way of looking at things through framing those questions and answering them in the best way that you have, looking at all the evidence that you can gather, and what it means, and that was helpful, because when your loyalty is to the question and their answer, your loyalty is not to particular disciplines. You really do not care which discipline the answers come from, but you do care that the answers are that the questions are answered with integrity, with the data integrity. So that's the.
So you also don't have to follow any frameworks of any particular discipline, which sometimes academic writers tend to do, because their work evolves within that discipline, and so is subject.
Yeah, but you have to be extremely careful. That's why you have to give it the time that it takes. For example, different disciplines have different starting points. So before you pick and choose and merge them, you have to understand completely the differing starting points. And very often it is not correct to pick and choose as you would like. To give an example, if you ask a population geneticist, he would probably agree that the broad point of when the first modern humans arrived in India. But if you ask an archaeologist, that answer is when the first modern humans arrived in India, that answer is probably slightly different. It's probably older. But that is because these two disciplines are looking at these two questions in a different manner. The geneticist is answering the question, when did modern humans who left behind an ancestry that is traceable today arrive in India? The archaeologist is saying, when can we find the earliest modern humans who left behind physical evidence of their arrival in India? And this
so not DNA evidence, but physical evidence.
Physical evidence. So these two can be different, because it's quite possible that the modern human population arrived in India in 100,000 years ago, and but got extinct because of some natural calamity or the other. But that the population that left behind a lineage that exists today arrived, whatever, 65,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago. So different disciplines have different starting points, different assumptions, and you need to take that on board before weighing both, or before you align them.
That's one of the actually interesting things that one takes away as a reader from this book, is that not only it answers some questions for us, but it also keeps telling us that you have to be open to new research that comes in. So this may not be the final word on this subject. In fact, it probably is not. There'll be a lot of more research and future answers to some of this. And some of these answers will change the ones that you've perhaps given in your book so far. You spoke earlier about, what the hot potato issues of the day and how they affect sometimes the research or the way that the results are put out. And this, you've also talked about this in your book, where some terminology used by researchers that you've referenced, for instance, ancient South Indian and ancient North Indian, how those terms came to be used by researchers. So could you talk to this a little bit, and also perhaps whether you faced any such political imperatives? Did you feel like you had to step around some things more carefully, other than in the way that you've addressed already, which was that you said that you also have to talk about methodology. It's not enough to just say scientists agree to this, but also the methodology that they've used. But did you feel that in your own use of terminology, you had to be circumspect because of political issues?
Before I come to this question specifically, can I go back to the previous question, because that is related to this also in some way?
Yes.
The previous question, one part of your question which I forgot to answer, which is what changed, what changed between the two editions. The first edition came out in 2018. It has been about 3 years. So there's a large number of studies that have come out in the last 3 years, and the new edition takes them on board. Each of those studies have substantially strengthened the conclusions of the book, the first edition, and in some cases have added significant additional material, additional insight into what we knew. I will take the most important. It will take too long to go into all of the additions. So I will just mention two big ones. One is the paper based on the ancient DNA recovered from the skeleton of a female person in the Harappan city of Rakhigarhi, going back to 4,600 years ago, roughly. And this study was published in 2019, roughly a year after the book was published. This was a study that was being looked forward to with great expectation by everybody who has been following the population formation of India, the Harappan civilization, or the Arya migration debate, because this was the most keenly awaited research in a very long time. And the research, the title of the research was a Harappan genome lacks ancestry from steppe pastoralists or Iranian farmers. That was the title of the study that appeared in 2019, based on the DNA of the Rakhigarhi person. Now, what did this signify? What did the study say? What is the meaning of the study? To understand the meaning of the study, you need to know another bit of information. That bit of information is that almost all population groups in India today carry varying but significant amounts of steppe pastoralist ancestry. That is today's situation. Now, when it says that the Harappan DNA lacks steppe pastoralist ancestry, it has only a clear and direct meaning, which is that the steppe pastoralist ancestry arrived in India after, at a later period, not during. It was not present during the Harappan civilization, and that's the only conclusion that is possible, and that's what the study actually says. I will read what the study says actually later. But anyway, so this proves the Arya migration
timelines, as it were.
You have more evidence than earlier. So this is one addition to the book that is there. Another addition, for example, is in recently there has been not recently, this discovery also happened around over 2 years ago, of 3 chariots from Sinoli in Uttar Pradesh. It has received a lot of attention, and the chariots have been dated to roughly 1900 BCE, within the period of the Arya migration, which genetic studies suggest happened between 2000 BCE and 1500 BCE. So there are studies like that that have been taken on board in the second edition, giving us a much clearer picture of the peopling of the subcontinent. Now to come to your later question on the interpretational differences. I will make a distinction between 2 things. One is peer-reviewed published research. Second is commentary on published peer-reviewed research. As far as published peer-reviewed research is concerned, I can't say that I have had serious areas of concern. By and large, published peer-reviewed research has delivered what it promises, which is conclusions based on facts. That's not what can be said about commentary based on published peer-reviewed research. And that, to explain that, I have to go back to the Harappan, the Rakhigarhi study. As I said, the conclusion of the Rakhigarhi study was pretty clear. The implication is pretty clear. And all reports in the rest of the world carried the study in that manner, which is that the Harappan DNA lacks step pastoralist ancestry, which means that the migrations happened later. Except a large number of Indian media outfits, whether it is television channels, whether it is newspapers, whether website, a lot of them carried stories saying there is no step ancestry in the Rakhigarhi DNA, and debunks the Arya migration theory. So you have the same fact, but a conclusion that is completely contradictory to what the study says. How did this happen? Obviously, because the information that was given out to the media in India was distorted, and the media did not check what the actual research paper said. And they did not keep in mind the fact of the matter that today there is significant step ancestry. So when you say there is no step ancestry in the Harappan DNA, the implication is pretty clear. And moreover, if they had actually read the paper, the paper says it clearly. Would you like me to? Sure. This is a sentence. Earlier, recorded massive population movements from the Eurasian steppe early in the 3rd millennium BCE, likely spreading Indo-European languages, that is into Europe. Now we reveal a parallel. Sorry, that is from another paper. So let me quote the correct one. However, a natural route for Indo-European languages to have spread into South Asia is from Eastern Europe via Central Asia. In the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE, a chain of transmission that did occur, as has been documented in detail with ancient DNA. So here is a paper putting in black and white what happened, and whose conclusions have clear implications, but has been reported in a manner that is completely opposite to what the study says. So this is what I mean when I say I do have, there's a problem with the way research is reported. And it would again take too long to go into the ANI-ASI issue. The book deals with it in a manner, but the problem is largely the same. The problem is not necessarily with ANI-ASI, which are theoretical constructs. Yeah. They are theoretical constructs, but defendable theoretical constructs. But the fact is, using those theoretical constructs, there was post-research commentary that made deductions that went against the actual meaning of the report. So this is something that happens again and again. And the only solution is for especially people who are following it or writing about it, to make sure that they actually read the report and do not go by interpretations alone.
And actually, that's another key concern even these days, even with Corona, for instance. One of the things that's come up is that media or reporters, how do you make sure that you're reading research correctly and reporting on it effectively without sort of taking, or rather drawing shortcuts for your readers, right?
I think I use a simple mechanism to check, which is any report on a scientific paper should quote actual lines from the paper when you are making critical statements. You can explain it in your own words, but you have to actually quote what the paper said. And very often you don't see such quotation because either they haven't taken the trouble of reading the actual paper, or they have taken the trouble and don't want to put it out there. So I think that's usually an indicator of whether a report is a faithful reproduction of what the research says. You have to be able to quote from it and then explain.
Right. I think I've been very selfish and focused on my questions so far. So I'm going to we've been receiving a fair number of reader questions, and I would ask anyone who's joined us on Facebook so far, if you have any other questions, please keep putting them in the question in the chat session, and our colleagues will put them here for us. So let me come to the first question from one of our audience members. Himika says, are North Indians genetically different from South Indians, and are the various castes genetically distinct groups? You speak to some of this in your book, if you could briefly address this.
The basic thing that we have to keep in mind is that all Indian population groups are mixtures of these 4 migrations that we talked about, but in varying proportions. But all population groups, except there might be a handful of small population groups, especially in South India, which may not have the steppe ancestry. But almost all of the population groups, that's the vast majority of population groups, are mixers of the 3 or 4 major migrations that we talked about. And when you said there are to varying degrees, what does that mean? In a geographical sense, you can say that northern and western India would have relatively more West Eurasian ancestry. Eastern India would have more of East Asian ancestry, and southern India would have more of First Indian ancestry. If you look at broadly, it has also been one of the researches that the book is based on, the population formation of South and Central Asia, which along with the Dakigadi study, and these are the 2 studies that have thrown a lot of light on population formation in recent years. It does talk about the steppe ancestry being higher in the higher caste in some regions, especially in some regions of the country. So, but I think what we have to keep in mind is that no matter where in the caste hierarchy you fall, no matter where in the region you live, no matter what religion you follow, no matter what language you speak, all Indian population groups share a significant ancestry of the first Indians. And there are relative variations of other migrations, but all population groups are mixed, and that doesn't change with either the caste status or regional status or language status or religion status.
Right. Marcia Sekuz asks, how do these processes change the Indian historiography, if at all? So how does it change would you like to address this directly? Change the Indian historiography?
One way of looking at is that today we have, as you also said earlier, which is that today we have the ability to understand more about the first Indians or population formation than we had earlier. because ancient DNA has thrown more light on these processes. So therefore, today we can focus more on aspects of our history that we had not earlier focused on. And this has implication for what I said, which is that I think there has to be much greater focus on periods that go even beyond the Harappan civilization. And that is one part. The second part is that the new research does throw up some new interesting facts, which definitely call for more research. For example, there is one of the population genetics papers comes to the conclusion that until around 100 CE, there was significant genetic mixing that happened between these different population groups in India. Remember that by around 1500 BCE, all four major constituents of the Indian population are already in, right?
All the migrations.
All four are in, right? The first Indians, West Asian, East Asian, Central Asian, all in. And from then until about 100 CE, that's more than 1500 years, that there is significant mixing between all of these population groups. And that mixing comes to an end around 100 CE. I would imagine not suddenly, but around that.
It slows down, as it were.
Yeah, I think, and the study comes to the conclusion that this is because of endogamy, which is the practice of marrying within one's own community. So around 100 CE, endogamy as a practice takes hold, and you can see that a population that has already significantly mixed then starts over a period of time stops the mixing, and the caste system, I would imagine, since endogamy is a significant feature of the caste system, one would imagine this suggests that the caste system in its full form, I'm sure there were proto variations of it, perhaps in some communities or in some regions, but as a much more enlarged and systematic scheme takes off around then. But it is not yet clear, if so, why? What really happened around that time? So this obviously calls for a lot more research into what happened around that time for this change to happen. Right. How did a proto caste system or a proto system of endogamy that may have been prevalent in a small manner in a small region, how did that expand ultimately to cover all of the population?
It became pretty widespread, and
and also the fact that of the mixing that happened for such a long period, it's stunning when you look at it, because today if you look at no matter how remote a population is, you will see the effects of that mixing that happened before 100 CE.
Right.
No matter how remote, no matter how which part of the country, you will see the effects of that mixing. And the only population group that stayed outside of this mixing in India is are the people in the Andaman Nicobar islands, because they were cut off from the mainland. And they also got mixed up once the colonialization began, because the Britishers started importing people from the mainland there, etc. But so that's the that's how I would say it sets up new agendas for
new questions to ask of Indian historiography. Yeah. Thank you. Shorashi asked the questions which I think you have to much degree already answered, but I'll read it out anyway. Can we conclusively say that India and South Asia share the same history or origins? India and the broader area of South Asia.
Yes, in a genetic sense, and to that extent, I mean, not to that extent, and to some extent in the cultural sense also. I think that's also one of the important lessons of understanding history in this manner, which is the commonality across the region, and also why people outside of South Asia may often find it difficult to separate one nationality from another. There is a reason for that.
Right. Coming to the next question, Survi says, is genetic purity a myth?
Absolutely. I think the race is not a valid concept. Why is race not a valid concept? Race is not a valid concept because all existing population groups are mixtures of previous population groups, which themselves are mixtures of previous population groups. The whole history of human race has been mixing. And it would be difficult to find a population. If you were today find what is purity, if you had to find a pure population group today, you had to find some group which has not been in contact with the rest of the world in some isolated continent somewhere, probably for 20,000 years. I don't think there is such a population. So the idea that there is of racial purity is not something that makes much sense today. And I think it's increasingly becoming so as mixing happens at ever more faster rates.
Right. From this, I'll jump one question. I'll go back to that later. But Aishwarya asks, can you talk about the origins of the first Indian population from Africa? I think you spoke about this briefly during the earlier questions, but perhaps you can speak to how do we arrive at that 65,000 is perhaps the time that the first out of Africa migrants arrived in India, and what they may have met there, perhaps.
Two pieces of evidence. One, I think by looking, as I said, there's genetic evidence suggests that all of the non-African population, that is modern human population outside of Africa, can trace their origin back to Africa. One simple example is that all of the non-African population are the descendants of a small subset of the African population that managed to move out around 70,000 years ago.
Successfully go out and
and that's correct. Successfully go out and spread. So that means that the genetic diversity in Africa is far more than the genetic diversity in the rest of the world, because they all ultimately boil down to this small group subsect of Africa, right? So and by looking at these kind of things, you can identify the out of Africa migration period. So that is roughly around 70,000 years ago. So that gives that end of this. So how do we arrive at 65,000 years or so for India? Now you have to keep looking at archaeological evidence. The trouble with India is that we have not found very old enough archaeological evidence. The earliest we find is probably around 28,000 years ago or so, fossil evidence of modern humans.
Humans, right.
But if you go, but there is archaeological evidence of modern humans being in Australia at least by around 59,000 years ago. And there is archaeological fossil evidence of modern humans being in Southeast Asia at least by 63,000 years ago. So, and that those populations could have reached there only by going through the Indian route. And we do have modern human fossils from Sri Lanka that may go back to 50,000 years ago, or even it's definitely older than the Indian one. So looking at all these archaeological evidence, you can come at the very rough conclusion that the modern Indian population should have reached India at least by around 65,000 years ago, if they were to reach Southeast Asia by 63,000 and Australia by 59,000 years ago.
All right, thank you. So there's one other question which comes back to your primary interest or your first interest into this, which is what is the relevance of the Harappan civilization in today's world? Could you?
It is the first civilization of the subcontinent. It is the largest, which we often forget, we often don't realize it. It is the largest civilization by far of its time, as large as the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations put together, both in terms of region and in terms of population. Its size in geographical terms would have been about 1/3 the size of India today, of the Republic of India today. So And imagine they had many things that were standardized, from weights and measures, which the Mesopotamians hadn't. The ways of setting up the city, the way the structures were built, the size of the brick. There's so many things. The seals that were used. 60% of all seals that have been recovered from the Harappan civilization has the unicorn seal. Is the unicorn seal, which is probably almost something like the Ashoka Chakra is for us today. Probably, we don't know what exactly it symbolizes. But so you can clearly see there were commonalities that were stunning across that region, and with none of the modern communication mechanisms available, none of the modern transport mechanisms available. How did they manage? How did this thing hang together for so long? 700 years in its mature form,
right,
from 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. And there is, unlike, and it was sweet, it's very different. Its impulses, we can see, were very different from those of other civilizations of its time. If you look at the Mesopotamian civilization, you can see temples, palaces, ostentatious burials for their kings. You will see none of this in the Harappan civilization. There's no evidence of large palaces. There is no evidence of huge burials. There's not even large, statues of kings. No, so we don't know what system of governance did they have. We don't know. It must have been very different from what the Mesopotamians had. And so there are all of these very fascinating facts and mysteries that are yet to be solved. At the same time, we also know there are so many things in the Harappan civilization. When you look at, you can see that looks familiar. That I can understand that it looks familiar to me. Whether it is the sheer, the amount of bangles that for both men and women who used to wear, and that's so stunning. The kind of utensils that they used to have some of them would still be in use in that form. Many of the designs, whether it is, you would still be very familiar to you. Some of the stories or images would remind you of Panchatantra stories. It may or may not be, but so there are all these allusions that there are at a fundamental level, many things might have seeped into the way that we do things even today, such as building houses around courtyards. That's the way houses were built, and that's the way things are built. So what we have to see is that when the Harappan civilization declined, I mean, we know the answer to the question, where did they come from? Harappans were a combination, were a mix of first Indians and a population related to the first farmers of Iran. So that's the answer to the question. Who were the Harappans? They were a mixture of first Indians and a population related to the first farmers of Iran. Where did they disappear? When their civilization declined because of a long drought, they dispersed east towards North India, south towards South India, all across the subcontinent, taking their ancestry as well as their culture across all over. So if you were to say that in the metaphor that I use in my book, this is the sauce that spread over the base of the pizza.
The base of the pizza.
The culture, and in both a cultural sense and in a genetic sense. So if you have to understand Indian culture, you have to understand more of the Harappan civilization as well, I think.
Right, and I think we're all hoping that it is not that is the one language that has not yet been decoded, correct, as it were. Could you speak a little bit about the significance of that, or what we?
The overwhelming evidence seems to suggest that the language that is spoken was a Proto-Dravidian, but until as you said, the script hasn't been deciphered, and there is no sign that it's about to be deciphered either. And even though other kinds of evidence keeps coming, keeps accumulating. For example, latest is a piece of research that says the word for elephant that was used in the Mesopotamian civilization, and Mesopotamian civilization got its elephants from India, and the word was the same as the word for elephant in Dravidian languages today, and used to be.
So you can
which suggests
see
that the language that was spoken in the Harappan civilization, which was in trade relations with the Mesopotamians, and from where the elephants would have gone to the from Harappa to the. So this explains. So there are lots of evidences like this. My book also talks about other kinds of evidence, but deciphered script is not one of them. Why one is negative about discovery being on the horizon is that you know that many of the earlier discoveries happened because you had you had some mechanism by which two languages were written side by side, and people knew one language and therefore could make out the other, like the Rosetta Stone. But until we come up some evidence like that, which can happen, but which is completely fortuitous, maybe in one of the excavations in Mesopotamia, perhaps, where we had strong trade relations with, or somewhere in the Indian excavation sites, we come up with a stone of that kind, which has both two different languages being treated. Otherwise, I think there is no immediate prospect of the language being deciphered.
All right. Thank you. With that, we're at an end with questions from the audience members. I'll end with one other question from my end, which is, what is your current work and what can we look forward to next?
My book is an extension of the book of early Indians. The early Indians itself, if you look at the early Indians, the book practically ends with the arrival of the last migrants, even though the epilogue looks very briefly at some happenings after that period as well. But by and large, the book ends with the arrival of the four migrants, the four migrations. The next book would look at what happened after that. So in a sense, it looks at the processes of all the processes that happened after that makes us what we are. And I'm about halfway into the work, and it's fascinating. Even more fascinating than the story of how our ancestors, of our ancestors and where they came from.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to that then, and good luck with that.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Tony. And to let our audience members know that this conversation will be available online for the next 1 week at least. Do please check it out or circulate the link amongst those of your friends who may not have been able to join us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Neha. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.